Welcome, fans, to another pregame recorded Aftershock. I am always excited whenever I get the chance to talk to Alicia Rodriguez. She is with Angels on Parade, and I mean, she does LAG Confidential. She does a lot of stuff, covering both NWSL and MLS these days. And Alicia, it's good to talk to you again. It's been a little while. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Jamon. Thanks so much for having me back on. I love the show.
I know. I remember last year how we would each go on to other podcasts and stuff. I remember we both talked to Ted Ramey, and we'd just be so complimentary about how wonderful the Quakes community was. And I was disappointed when, unfortunately, you weren't able to continue covering the Quakes. And now you're all doing this from the East Coast. I'm up in Seattle. You're on the East Coast. Like everything's changing, huh?
Yeah, but luckily we have this thing called the internet, which allows us to do things like this. So I'm really grateful both that I was able to move for personal reasons with my family, but I still get to cover the teams, some of the teams in California. Obviously, have a lot of time for the Quakes still, even if I'm not on the beat these days. So yeah, it's different than it was last year, but I think we're still in a good spot.
Same for me as well. And one of the things that we got to kind of have in common there for a while were some of the crazy press conferences that we sat in with Matias Almeida. You know, those were the days, as they say. We will probably reminisce about some of those for years to come. We were talking before we went on the air about how the current coaches, they're all nice guys. I think they do their best, but sometimes you need that kind of coaching personality, like a Bob Bradley or like a Matias Almeida, to really give you those juicy quotes. And sometimes you're just like, man, what can I actually say out of all this stuff that was said? But that's not all that interesting. You know, how are things right now with between Vanny and Cherundolo?
Yeah, I would say that they are less fireworks than some of those coaches of yore that you mentioned. But for us in the media, I think it's an opportunity for us to flex a few different muscles when it comes to asking questions, right? Like we have to be smart about how we ask questions, because if you ask the wrong question to the wrong person at the wrong time, you're going to get shut down, and you want to do your best to not get shut down. And I know I've been shut down many times, but keeps me on my toes. So yeah, it's a different experience, but I think a little more milk toast. But we still get good stuff if we can ask good questions.
I think there's a art to it, because I remember with Almeida, like he did not like me. And let's be clear, Alex Morgan was his favorite, but I think you were very high up there, and quite often you would get to kick off and get to ask the first question. And a lot of it is with the first question, you're kind of asking the like obvious thing, but you're also softening them up to be able to maybe ask another question later on and get better responses. Sometimes the quotes that you use are not from the question you asked. It's that you had to soften them up so someone else could ask a question, and the juicier quotes will come later. So there is a real art to it. And I think a lot of times fans just want us, like, particularly after a loss, to just go in and just blast them and tell them what a bad game they had or something like that. Like, how do you approach asking like that first question, in the press conference in order to start to get things going?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that about the Quakes, because I felt like we had a core group of people together in the that year and a half when I was on the beat, where we, I think, had a pretty solid idea of what everyone else would, the kinds of things that everyone else would ask coming
Right.
in. So like you said, a lot of times I had the first question, and because the custom in San Jose is not to do like a coach, tell us how you felt about the game statement to start things off, which some teams do. Most of the time that was me. So I basically had to be like, hey, how was the game, coach? If it was good, hey, great job on the game, coach. How was it? If it
You
was
just
bad,
lost 5-0. How
yeah,
how do you think it went today?
what are your thoughts coming out of that thing? So yeah, it was, in some ways it was easy to ask that question because it was literally the most obvious question out there. But I think you're right in that for our group, it was a nice way to sort of like ease Matthias into the press conference, kind of get a feel for how he was feeling coming out of it, and maybe how we might be able to get some, good answers, things that we could really take off with from that. Nowadays, I would say with the LA teams, it's a lot more, the press corps is a lot more fluid. So it's hard to sort of say, well, this person's going to ask the tactical question, and this person's going to ask the emotional question, and this person's going to
Got
ask
it.
that kind of thing. So it's a little bit different dynamic, but no, that's part of why I like the Quakes beat, was because I feel like we had a good rapport as a group, that we really had a pretty good beat on kind of what our roles were coming in. So
Alex and I would text each other because we would identify which version of Matthias we were getting on a particular day. Like, oh, today it's a reflective Matthias, or today it's quiet Matthias. He's going to give us nothing. So we always would have to try to go like, how can we actually ask something that'll get him to kind of like come out of his shell if he's inside of a shell that day. And sometimes we did, and sometimes we laid an egg. What can you do?
Yep, exactly.
Well, speaking of coaches, you've got a new one in LAFC and a team that finds themselves at the top of the table. And here's what's really interesting, because I remember when Steve Cherundolo's name was put out there, when he was coaching the Las Vegas Lights, and his name was put out there as the potential coach of LAFC, at least from my part of Twitter, there seemed to be a lot of blowback as to like, Las Vegas isn't a very good team. What is LAFC doing here? Bob Bradley, I think we all saw the writing on the wall. He wasn't going to stay. It wasn't really a money thing or anything else. It just wasn't, something I think that intrigued him any longer to continue in LA. And so, but he's got this team first place in the Western Conference. What is it that Cherundolo is doing right, where at the end of Bradley's time there was going so wrong?
Yeah, I think you're right in that Bob's tenure seemed to run its course. He takes a lot of inspiration from like Pep Guardiola, who usually stays at a team for 3 or 4 years and moves on. I think for Bob, it was pretty similar. I think it was just like, this is time to go. So I think what's worked so far this season for Cherundolo is he's made some tweaks, but he hasn't completely overhauled the team style of play. Last season was very weird in that I think the lack of depth was exposed for LAFC for sure. But the underlying numbers for the entire season were really good, and they were performing really, like the actual results were really bad. And so it just seemed like, to an extent, kind of a fluke. And obviously you're the advanced stats guy. That's not my forte, but I certainly pay attention to them as much as I can. And it seemed a little fluky that they just had such a bad run all season long, when the underlying numbers are saying they're actually pretty good. And it's weird that they keep losing the ways that they do. So I think to an extent, this season has been kind of a regression back to the mean. Usually when we say that in a bad way, like they're coming down back to earth. I think in this case, it was like the floor is rising. They're getting better again. But I also think that the tweaks he's made have been effective. With Bob, towards the end, it was a lot of the defense really getting completely stretched out. It was a similar situation to, I think, the end of the Almeida, time with the Quakes, where attackers, you'd get 2 or 3 attackers like shooting straight downfield. You'd have one defender try to stop it, and of course, more often than not, they couldn't do it, and they'd get torched. LAFC are not finding themselves in that position hardly ever these days. They're much more stout. They're not making any huge shifts, but I think there's a little more balance on both sides of the ball, and I think that was necessary after all the problems that we had seen. LAFC had one really good season defensively under Bradley, and I would say 3 seasons where they were mediocre at best, and sometimes very, admittedly, really quite poor. So the balance is back. I think that's helped a lot. And not rocking the boat too much, keeping things that are working, and changing the things that maybe aren't working as much.
One of the things I remember you and I would DM about a little bit last season was the goalkeeping, because in those advanced stats numbers, a lot of it did point somewhat to the defense, but a lot of it pointed to the goalkeeping, which I remember your comments were somewhere in the range. You can correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but somewhere in the range of the season, it started off really badly with the first 2 goalkeepers. Then the third goalkeeper was like average. And overall, like the numbers were pretty bad on the goalkeeping side of things. But the offseason happens, and now you got Maxime Crepeau, who, and by the way, there's 10 different ways to say his name according to all the different announcers I've heard. So maybe you can tell us what the right way is. But he's come in, and is he a big reason, do you feel, for this turnaround? Is getting the right goalkeeper in place that big of a difference in this team?
I think so. Yeah. It's easy, but I think it's effective. Kripo was outstanding for Vancouver, and Vancouver was a pretty bad team. It was a classic situation of a good goalkeeper who sees a lot of shots on a poor team. In some ways, that helps his stats, and in some ways, it hurts his stats. So, but I think based on kind of the underlying numbers, based on the eye test, we could all see that Kripo was a good player for Vancouver. He goes to LAFC, a team where I think the expectations are higher, and he's done really well so far. I mean, I can't think of a single game where I'd say, "Oh man, he really screwed that up," and that cost him the game. I wouldn't say there's been too many games where you'd say he stood on his head, and if it wasn't for him, then there's no way they would have won. But I think to an extent, it's because um, it's gelling pretty well. And so he doesn't have to stand on his head. Like things are working out pretty well. And I do think there's going to come a game where he is going to have to really step up in order to keep LAFC in the game, to win it for him. But yeah, he's definitely improved that position, no question about it. I think you can make a pretty convincing case that he's the best goalkeeper LAFC have had to date. They've had a lot of goalkeepers in a very short amount of time, so there's a lot to choose from so far.
So one of the players that really kind of impressed me in the second half of last season was Chicho Arango. He really seemed to almost put that team on his shoulders and almost got it, into where they needed to be from a playoff perspective. Just faced too much on I guess the goalkeeping and defensive side to prevent that from happening. But what do you see from him so far this season? I heard the mentioning on Extra Time the other day that he hasn't had quite the season that people expected. Has he had a dip in form compared to the way he finished 2021?
He has. He got off to a slow start this season. He had COVID, I think, right before the start of training camp, and that derailed a call up to the Colombian national team, which I think is a pretty big bummer, especially for an MLS player going
Sure.
to Colombia. And then he took a knock in preseason, and they were pretty cagey about like, well, no, he's fine. No, actually, he's pretty hurt. And so we never really got the full story on what was going on there, but it was something that limited him for quite a while. So he started the season coming off the bench. And in the meantime, Kwadwo Opoku, a young Ghanaian striker, started getting the minutes basically, and really, I think, put together several quite good performances. He basically created his own goal to win in Miami early in the season. So LAFC didn't really seem to miss Arango too much in the early going. He has started scoring. He scored, I think, 3 or 4 goals in Open Cup, and then he scored 2 or 3 goals so far in league play. So, he's starting to rack up some goals. One of the concerns I had when LAFC signed him was, even though he had spent a little bit of time, and by a little bit, I mean a little bit of time in Europe, he had spent most of his career in his native Colombia. He was really on a hot streak when they signed him. He had been playing for Millonarios in Colombia, and won the scoring title there. And he had never really gotten anything close to those kind of numbers, consistently before. Obviously, players can have a career year. Like that's kind of how sports works. But I was a little bit concerned that, he might be a flash in the pan. He started his tenure with LAFC on fire. So last year he was really great. I think he's doing fine, but I think we're starting to get to the point where even I'm a little bit like, I don't know, it would be nice if he was chipping in with a few more goals every now and then. At the same time, LAFC have really spread the goal scoring load around so far this year. So it's been pretty remarkable. There really hasn't been anyone who is scoring all the goals these days. Obviously, Vela scored a few, but he's a leading scorer so far. But it's really a mixed bag, and more or less, it's working so far for them.
Well, we definitely have to talk about the rumors around Giorgio Chiellini, because it's gotten stronger and stronger that he's going to be a part of this LAFC squad fairly soon, potentially. The latest I think was that his wife needed to sign off on the deal or something along those lines. That hear something new every day, but obviously he's been a staple at Juventus for a long time and had a very successful career. What do you make of this particular move, and given actually some of the success that this team has had from the defensive side this season, and young players starting to step up there as well? And maybe you can talk about what the back line looks like right now. But what is your thought process about him coming in and potentially disrupting this chemistry that does now seem to be forming on that back line? Is this a positive, or is it, you think, potentially going to change the course of the season if it doesn't go well?
Well, I mean, that's, if we knew, then we could make a decision on it pretty easily, right? But
you and I make all the decisions.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and I think a lot of people who have been really skeptical about this edition have a right to feel that way. Certainly, for me, I think there's a few reasons why it might make sense, and I would say might. First, I think LAFC noticed in the last couple of years that um, if you lose your depth in defense, you're really pretty screwed. Like, can you have too many defenders? Honestly, maybe not. And they've been having some injury troubles lately with the fullbacks, so they've gotten pretty stretched thin, and they've had to fill a center back or a midfielder in at right back for the last like 2 or 3 games. So even though they've built up their depth in the off season, it's still a concern of sorts. And I think at the same time, given how fixture congestion is becoming more and more of an issue over the past few years, it should be a policy for coaches to have to rotate. Not like I'm mandating it, but like they should just rotate as a policy, of course, right, to make sure that their players stay fresh and don't get overworked. So in that regard, I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense if he comes in with the attitude of like, of course, I'm not going to start every game. I'm going to play 10 times and, do my part. I'm not coming here to suck up the oxygen in the room and, be treated like a king. Like if he comes in with the right attitude, I think it can make some sense. He's also fluent in English, so there's not going to be an issue with, language barrier. He has an economics degree. He seems like a guy who, has interests outside of the sport and maybe wants an adventure in his life and, would be in the right mindset to want to come do something different and cool and, something out of the ordinary from what he's used to. And then I think as well, to me, maybe the most intriguing, like kind of 10,000 foot view of this is I think LAFC have a potential star in their hands in Mamadou Fall, who's 19. He might have just turned 20. Center back, basically took it in the second half of last season, took the starting spot and has never looked back. He's been dominant. He scores more goals than most center backs would score. He's a dominant presence in the back. The advanced stats love him. I mean, he really seems like quite a gem. There's a part of me that thinks that Chiellini signing with LAFC would give him an opportunity to mentor Fall directly and sort of say, like, here's what you need to work on if you want to get to the highest level. Like, here's how much you need to step up. Like, you're at a good spot, but like, you got a lot of work to do, kid, in order to really make it to the big time. I also think that there's a chance that if, things go good, he hits it off, the mentor relationship works out great, he'll start talking to outlets in Italy. Wow, this Mamadou Fall kid is really something. Somebody better snap him up pretty fast. Like, this kid's special. That could help LAFC's transfer value quite a bit in selling him. And so I know that seems a little bit like 4D chess, really spinning things out. Right? I think it's something that would help explain why this somewhat quizzical move would make some sense. If they're able to sell Fall for 25 million, this is a no-brainer if you're going to spend a TAM salary on Chiellini for 18 months, right? Like, it's all going to work out. It's going to be great. Obviously, there's a lot of potentials for pitfalls in all this, but that long view, perhaps it might make some sense.
Well, analytics has improved sometimes the evaluation of players. I mean, word of mouth like that, like you just described, is still probably the biggest way that business gets done. And if you're going to be able to move players, it's not because someone's looking at MLS analytics and going like, hey, there's a kid here. Why don't we pay them $15 million? It's because someone is going to be talking him up and going like, no, you really need to look at this kid. He's worth that kind of money. He's going to be a superstar, and you need to be a first mover on this. So certainly that is still a big part of how all this works. And I could certainly see why that does make sense. And it's a perspective that that only Alicia can bring, and this is why we have you on the show.
Leave it to me to come up with that explanation.
Exactly. So both of these teams, the Earthquakes and LAFC, decided to lay eggs in the Open Cup last night. Both had, both have had good parts of the season, and the Earthquakes more recently, and both have of late struggled a little bit. Not only that, a couple injuries last night. You and I were talking about coming on the air. Can you just kind of brief us with, LAFC ran out of first choice lineup. So did the Galaxy last night. It's kind of had set things up for that, and maybe paid a bit of a price for doing so. What's the latest on the injuries for LAFC now?
So LAFC saw Carlos Vela, their superstar, depart in the 20th minute last night due to a left quad injury. A lot of people were pretty skeptical. I think in the heat of the loss, sort of thought, maybe he was dogging it a little bit. I mean, I think at this point he's had a couple of long-term injuries with LAFC. So to me, taking care of yourself and not, playing through injury and risking being out for 6 months is probably the way to go. As far as his availability, I don't know at this point. They're going to do a media availability tomorrow. So that would probably be the first that we'll get any sort of sense if he'll be in consideration against San Jose. My gut would say probably not. And at most, probably he would come off the bench if he is available. So I know that there's one goal that Quakes fans probably want to forget, Vela scoring. So they probably won't mind if he, stays on the bench for the night.
Probably not.
The other injury was to left back Diego Palacios. He got undercut on a play and basically landed on his neck. It looked pretty dangerous. He was down for quite a while. He was removed as a concussion substitute, which I believe is the first time I've seen it. LAFC use a concussion sub since the rule was implemented. He walked off on his own power. I mean, it was one of those situations where we were a little afraid that they were going to have to bring the card out and take him straight to the hospital. He got up under his own power eventually. So it doesn't look like he broke his neck. So, all things considered, that's what we really care about in this situation. I don't expect he'll play, especially if he's in concussion protocol. That would seem to be way too soon to come back from that. Left back, there's a few different options. Ryan Hollingshead has been playing like goofy footed on, he's usually a right back, but he has been playing left back this season, and he's just come back from injury. So I think it's pretty likely he will slot in. If it's not him, then it's going to be interesting. We'll have to see which center back or midfielder slots in there because then it gets a little shallow in the pool there.
The Quakes had none of their backline last night against Sac Republic. All four players, Calvo, national team duty, went early to Costa Rica to take care of some personal things he had to take care of, and will be there now for actually missing the next at least 2 Quakes games. Maybe it's the third. I think it's just the next 2. Nathan has been in health and safety protocols, a bit of a question mark as to whether he will see action on Saturday or not. Paul Marie was held out last night at the advice of trainers. He had played something like 6 or 7 straight games, including the Open Cup, 120-minute affair. And they just were saying like, okay, you got to give this guy some time off. So he didn't play last night. And then Marcos Lopez has had a bit of an injury as well. So it'll be very interesting what the Quakes roll out there for backline. To your point about backline depth and can you have enough defenders? The Quakes are getting kind of tested right now, and it'll be really interesting to see what a high-powered offense such as LAFC's is able to do. I'm interested in, Bob Bradley kind of had his way of doing things. And I have to look back and go like the 2019 LAFC team in particular, I think was the most explosive offensive juggernaut we've ever seen in this league. And I think even today, like what the players kind of took from that season, you see carried into the style and the way that they play. They just know when they get to the final third, they have a plan. They know how to execute it. They do it extremely well, and it results in almost like system type goals because this is LAFC football. This is the way that we play. How much of that would you say has been kind of retained under Cherundolo? How much of that has he kind of incorporated new ideas into the attack? Talk to me a little bit about kind of how this whole transition, has gone, particularly from that attacking perspective.
Yeah, I think you're right that the patterns of play have largely stayed intact. I think they do a really good job of varying their approach. So you don't see the same, like, get to the end line and cross, get to the end line and hit a cutback, play up the middle and walk the ball into the net. Like, they do all kinds of different things. And I think that obviously has been to their credit over time in being effective, having weapons who get the ball and can actually finish. That for the most part hasn't really changed, even though some of the personnel has changed up top over the years. I think what's different this year is they've had two trends that may or may not be sustainable, probably not sustainable at the rates they have been. One is they've been really, really good on set pieces, and in particular corner kicks. They've scored more goals than they've ever scored in a season already, just a third of the way through the season, from set pieces, but largely that comes from corner kicks. So that's been a positive, because that's something in the past they really haven't taken advantage of very often, free kicks and corner kicks. So that's something that they've somehow added to their bow, and so far it's been effective this season. The other thing is, and this I think has been the biggest surprise, is Bradley sometimes would be a little bit reluctant to bring players off the bench. I would not characterize him as a coach who does not use his subs. Some coaches around the league, like, they're not going to use their full complement of subs, like, pretty much ever.
Right.
He certainly would sometimes, but you got the sense that he was sort of like, I'm ride or die with my starters most of the time. And I may have one or two guys that I want to bring in, but the other guys, it's like, it's only if you get hurt or if we're really in a, holding on for the game or something like that. Like, otherwise I'm sticking with my guys. Cherundolo has done a really good job of incorporating the bench, and they've also set a team record for goals scored in a season off the bench already, again, a third of the way through the season. And some of that's come from players like Vela. Vela scored the winner last weekend in league play in Columbus, coming off the bench. Normally he's not a bench player, but still he technically came off the bench in that game. Jose Cifuentes, who was arguably the breakout player last season for LAFC, all three of his goals scored have been off the bench. Ismail Tajuri Shradi, he was an addition this season. He's been hurt most of the time, but the limited minutes he scored 2 goals off the bench already. So on and so forth. There's been a bunch of other guys who scored off the bench. So it's really pretty remarkable so far. So I think that's been the big change thus far. And again, it's a really small sample size. I don't want to sort of make sweeping conclusions based on 15 games of Steve Cherundolo's coaching career at MLS level, but he does seem to be doing a better job of making impactful subs and getting those subs to be productive and actually help in the outcome of games. If it's something that he can really cultivate and continue to do, that's going to be a really good skill for him as a coach, and something that's going to make him really in demand pretty much anywhere in the future.
Well, Alicia, it's great talking to you as always. Fans, of course, if you enjoy these videos, be sure to like them, subscribe to Quakes Epicenter's videos, turn on the notifications so you'll know when we've posted them. We still have a couple special things coming your direction, including an interview with a front office member. I think that's going to hit during international break now. I'm going to push that out just a little bit more, as well as something that we are planning that I think will be a lot of fun. So you're going to want to turn on the notifications for that. And then if you can, join our Patreon, $2, $5, $15 tiers, whichever you prefer. If the benefits matter to you, check us out at quakesepicenter.com/Patreon. Alicia, as always, great talking to you. I miss getting to interact with you more and having you in the Quakes press conferences and all the stress being on, Alex and myself and a couple other people to try to figure out the questions. But on the positive side, we got a lot more Robert Jonas this year, so that's also good as well. But glad to hear that everything's gone well with your move, and good luck on Saturday. And I'm sure you and I will be sending a couple DMs throughout the game with our observations.
Of course, and I always have love. I told you ahead of the show, I always have love for the Quakes. So we're still part of the MLS family together. But yeah, I always have time for San Jose. So thanks for having me on.
We'll be talking to you. And if you can, by the way, afterward, I know you sometimes are on deadline and stuff, but if you got a chance and stop by the show, feel free to stop by the live show afterwards, and maybe we'll get to catch you then if possible. So take care. Thanks, fans, for joining us. And we will bring, of course, the Aftershock post-game show to you immediately following the Earthquakes and LAFC on Saturday. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.